I need to tell someone about what happened at Whitmore and Sons Funeral Home before I lose my nerve completely. My name is Marcus Webb, and 3 months ago I thought I'd landed the perfect job. Night shift at a funeral home in Bledsoe County, Tennessee. Good pay, quiet work, and all I had to do was watch over the place while the dead rested peacefully. I should have known better when old Samuel Whitmore hired me on the spot without checking references. "You got a strong stomach, son," he'd asked, his cloudy blue eyes studying me from behind wire-rimmed glasses. The funeral home's parlor smelled of lilies and something else I couldn't place. Something earthy and old. "Yes, sir," I'd replied, desperate for work after losing my construction job when my back gave out. "Good. Night watchman pays $18 an hour cash. You start Monday." He'd slid a folded piece of yellowed paper across his mahogany desk. "Rules are simple. Follow them exact and you'll do just fine." I should have read those rules right then and there. Instead, I stuffed them in my pocket and shook his cold, papery hand. The funeral home sat on 10 acres outside Pikeville, a Victorian mansion that had been converted sometime in the 1940s. 3 stories of weathered white clapboard with a wraparound porch and black shutters that never seemed to hang quite straight. The basement housed the preparation rooms. The first floor contained viewing parlors and offices, and the second floor served as storage for caskets and supply. The third floor was locked, and Samuel made it clear I wasn't to go up there. My first night, I arrived at 10 p.m. as instructed. The day staff, Samuel's son Robert, and the mortician, a thin woman named Iris Chappell, were finishing up in the basement. I could hear the hum of refrigeration units and the occasional clink of metal instruments. "You must be Marcus," Iris said when she emerged, wiping her hands on a towel. She'd salt and pepper hair pulled back severely and the palest skin I'd ever seen on a living person. "Samuel told me you'd be starting tonight." "Yes, ma'am. Just need to know where everything is." She walked me through the building methodically. The main parlor has its burgundy velvet drapes and rows of folding chairs. The family consultation room has soft lighting and boxes of tissues. The kitchenette, where I could make coffee. The small office near the front door was where I'd spend most of my time. "Bathroom's down that hall," she said, pointing toward the back of the building. "Don't use the one by the preparation rooms unless it's an emergency. And Marcus," she turned to face me, her gray eyes serious, "read those rules Samuel gave you tonight. Don't wait." After she left, I settled into the office chair and pulled out the paper. The rules were handwritten in Samuel's shaky script. Night shift products, Whitmore and Sons Funeral Home. Never leave the building between midnight and 4 a.m., regardless of what you hear outside. Check all viewing room doors at 11 p.m., 1 a.m., and 3 a.m. If any door is open that should be closed, close it immediately and do not look inside. If you hear piano music, ignore it completely. Do not investigate the source. The basement preparation rooms are off limits after 10 p.m. If you hear activity down there, assume it's Iris working late. Do not answer the phone between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Let the machine pick up. If someone knocks on the front door after midnight, check the peephole. If the person appears normal but the reflection is missing in the glass, do not open the door. Keep the coffee pot running all night. Fresh pot every 2 hours. This is essential. If you see a woman in a white dress on the second floor, politely acknowledge her presence but do not engage in conversation. The third floor door must remain locked at all times. If you find it open, close it immediately and call Samuel, regardless of the hour. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Follow the rules and you'll be fine. I read through them twice, waiting for the punchline, some kind of initiation prank for the new guy, but the paper felt old and the ink had that faded quality that comes with time. At the bottom, in different handwriting, were the faded signatures of previous night watchmen. David Chen, 2019, Maria Santos, 2021, Jake Morrison, 2023. The first few hours passed quietly. I made my 11 p.m. rounds, checking the 3 viewing parlors and the consultation room. All doors were closed, as they should be. I brewed coffee in the kitchenette, the rich aroma helping mask that underlying earthiness that seemed to permeate the building. At 12:30 a.m., I heard the piano. It drifted down from somewhere upstairs, a slow, mournful version of Amazing Grace. The notes were clear and precise, played by someone with real skill. I stood at the bottom of the staircase, listening. The music was beautiful, haunting in the way that funeral hymns always were. Rule 3 echoed in my mind. If you hear piano music, ignore it completely. I forced myself back to the office and turned up the small radio I'd brought, letting classic rock drown out the hymn. But even through the guitars and drums, I could still hear it underneath. That slow, precise melody that seemed to come from the very walls. My 1 a.m. rounds were uneventful. All doors remained closed. The piano had stopped, leaving only the normal sounds of an old building settling. I made fresh coffee as instructed, though I couldn't understand why that particular rule was essential. At 2:15, the phone rang. I stared at it, remembering Rule 5. The old rotary phone set on Samuel's desk, black and heavy with age. It rang 6 times before the ancient answering machine kicked in. Whitmore and Sons Funeral Home. Samuel's recorded voice crackled through the speaker. We're currently closed. Please leave a message or call during business hours. The beep was followed by silence. Then, very faintly, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths that went on for nearly a minute before the line went dead. I checked the clock. 2:17. Still in the danger zone. The phone rang again at 2:33. Same pattern. 6 rings, machine pickup, breathing. This time, though, the breathing sounded different, wetter, like someone with fluid in their lungs trying to speak. By 3 a.m., I was grateful for the distraction of my rounds. The viewing parlors were on the first floor, arranged around the central hallway. Parlor A, where services were held for the more prominent families. Parlor B, for standard services. Parlor C, a smaller space for private viewings. All doors were closed, but as I approached Parlor B, I noticed the brass handle was turned downward, as if someone had just released it. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. Rule 2 was specific. If any door is open that should be closed, close it immediately and do not look inside. But the door wasn't open. Not technically. I tested the handle. Locked, as it should be. However, the position, with its slight downward tilt, suggested it had been used recently. I made fresh coffee with shaking hands, grateful for the familiar routine. The smell helped calm my nerves, and I noticed something odd. The underlying earthiness that I'd smelled since my first day was almost completely masked when the coffee was fresh. When it got old, sitting too long, that other scent crept back in. Maybe that's why Rule 7 existed. At 4:03, the danger zone ended, and I allowed myself to relax slightly. Dawn was still hours away, but the worst seemed to be over. I settled back into the office chair and tried to focus on a paperback novel I'd brought. That's when I heard the footsteps upstairs. Slow, measured steps across the second floor, back and forth like someone pacing. I grabbed my flashlight, the building's lighting was deliberately dim at night, and headed for the stairs. The second floor stored caskets, urns, and various supplies. Rows of metal shelving created narrow aisles between displays of mahogany, oak, and pine coffins. The footsteps seemed to be coming from the far end, near the windows that faced the cemetery behind the building. I moved carefully between the shelves, flashlight beam dancing across brass handles and silk interiors. The steps had stopped, but I could feel a presence nearby. The temperature seemed to have dropped 10 degrees. "Hello?" I called softly, immediately regretting it. That's when I saw her. A woman in a white dress stood at the far end of the aisle, her back to me. The dress looked vintage, perhaps from the 1940 with a high neckline and long sleeves. Her dark hair was styled in victory rolls. She stood perfectly still, facing the window. Rule 8 flashed through my mind. If you see a woman in a white dress on the second floor, politely acknowledge her presence, but do not engage in conversation. Good evening, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned slowly, and I saw a face that might have been beautiful once. Her features were delicate, almost porcelain-like, but her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, from corner to corner. She nodded once, a barely perceptible acknowledgement, then turned back to the window. I backed away carefully, not turning around until I reached the stairs. My heart hammered as I descended to the first floor, and I spent the rest of my shift in the office. Door closed, radio playing softly. Samuel arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, same as always. He looked rested, completely normal, as if phantom piano players and eyeless women were just another Tuesday. How was your first night, son? Quiet, I lied. Followed all the rules, he nodded approvingly. Good. That's how you stay safe in this business. The dead don't bother nobody who shows proper respect. Over the following weeks, I settled into a routine. The rules weren't suggestions, they were survival instructions. I learned this the hard way when I made my first major mistake. It was my third Thursday, around 1:30 a.m. I was making fresh coffee when I heard something that made my blood freeze. Voices in the basement. Not one voice that could be explained away as Iris working late. Multiple voices, having what sounded like a conversation. I could hear the rise and fall of different tones, though I couldn't make out actual words. Rule 4 said to assume any activity down there was Iris working late. But Iris had never worked this late before, and these definitely weren't the sounds of embalming or preparation work. Against my better judgment, I crept to the basement door. The voices were clearer now, at least 3 distinct speakers, maybe 4. The conversation had an odd quality, like people talking underwater or through thick cloth. I turned the handle and opened the door just a crack. The basement was dark except for the green glow of the refrigeration unit displays, but in that faint light I could see figures moving in the preparation room. Tall, thin shadows that moved wrong, too fluid, like they were floating rather than walking. One of them turned toward the door, and I caught a glimpse of a face that was more skull than flesh, empty sockets where eyes should be, jaw hanging open at an impossible angle. I slammed the door shut and ran back to the office, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The voices continued for another hour, gradually fading as dawn approached. The next morning, Samuel took one look at me and frowned. "You look like hell, boy. What happened?" I told him about the voices, about opening the basement door. His expression grew increasingly serious. "Marcus, I want you to listen to me very carefully. The rules aren't suggestions. They're not guidelines. They're the difference between walking out of here in the morning and," he gestured vaguely, "not walking out." He led me to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder marked previous employees. David Chen, 2019. Good worker. Followed most of the rules. Got curious about the piano music one night. Went looking for it. Found him 3 days later in the 3rd floor room, catatonic. Never spoke another word. He flipped to another page. Maria Santos, 2021. Answered the phone during forbidden hours because she thought it might be an emergency. Heard something that changed her. Quit the next day, moved to California. Last I heard, she was in a psychiatric facility. Another page. Jake Morrison, lasted until last year. Strong boy, reminded me of you. Started getting careless with the rules around month 3. Found him in the basement one morning, aged 30 years overnight. Hair white as snow, hands shaking like a man of 90. He couldn't tell me what he'd seen down there. Samuel closed the folder. The dead aren't gone, Marcus. They're just different. This place sits on ground that's been a burial site for over 200 years. Native Americans, then settlers, and finally the official cemetery. There are layers down there, son. Layers of people who aren't quite ready to move on. Why not just close the place down? I asked. Because someone has to watch them. Someone has to maintain the boundaries. The rules exist because people like you and me figured out, through trial and error, how to coexist with whatever's down there. Break the rules, and those boundaries get thin, real thin. That night, I followed every rule to the letter. When the piano music started at 12:45, I turned up my radio and focused on my book. When something knocked on the front door at 2:30, I didn't even look up from my coffee. But at 3:15 a.m. during my rounds, I discovered that following the rules perfectly didn't guarantee safety. Parlor B's door was standing wide open. I stood in the hallway, flashlight beam illuminating the dark interior. I could see the outline of a casket on the viewing stand, flowers arranged around it. The room smelled of lilies and an earthy undertone that was now stronger, almost overwhelming. Rule 2 was clear. If any door is open that should be closed, close it immediately and do not look inside. But as I reached for the handle, something inside the room moved. Not the body in the casket. I was careful not to look directly at that. Something else, moving between the chairs arranged for mourners. A shadow that didn't correspond to any light source. I grabbed the door handle and pulled it shut, turning the lock with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. Back in the office, I called Samuel's emergency number. Parlor B door was open, I reported when he answered on the second ring. You close it? Yes, sir. Good. That means Mrs. Henderson is restless. She's scheduled for burial tomorrow, but something's keeping her tethered. Happens sometimes with sudden deaths. You did right. There was something else in there, I said. Long pause. What kind of something? A shadow, moving around the chairs. Another pause, longer this time. Marcus, you've been doing good work, real good, but I need to tell you something about Parlor B. Sometimes the recently deceased attract attention from the older residents. The ones downstairs have been waiting a long time. Fresh death draws them like moths to flame. What does that mean for me? Double check all the locks before you leave in the morning. Make sure the coffee stays fresh. And Marcus, if you hear any more activity in the basement tonight, you must not have heard it. Understand? I understood, but it didn't make the next few hours any easier. The building seemed more alive somehow, filled with small sounds that could have been the settling of wood or something else entirely. At 4 a.m., as the danger zone ended, I heard the voices from the basement again. This time, though, I followed Samuel's advice and ignored them completely. I focused on my book, my coffee, and the normal sounds of an old building in the small hours of the morning. By 5 a.m., everything had gone quiet. When Samuel arrived that morning, he looked relieved to see me sitting normally in the office, radio playing softly, coffee fresh in the pot. How'd the rest of the night go? Quiet, I said, and this time it wasn't entirely a lie. Good. Mrs. Henderson's service is at 2 p.m. today. Should settle things down some. But things didn't settle down. If anything, they got worse. The following week brought new challenges. The phone calls during forbidden hours became more frequent and more disturbing. Instead of just breathing, I began to hear whispers, words, in languages I didn't recognize. Sometimes what sounded like multiple voices layering over each other. The woman in the white dress appeared more often too, sometimes in different locations on the second floor. Always the same polite nod when I acknowledged her, always turning away to stare out whatever window was nearest. And the piano music was getting more complex. What started as simple hymns evolved into full concert pieces. Bach, Mozart, and compositions that required serious skill to play. Sometimes I could hear more than one piano, harmonizing in ways that shouldn't have been possible in a building that, as far as I knew, didn't contain a single piano. I mentioned this to Samuel during one of our brief morning conversations. Building's been here since 1890, he said. Lots of history in these walls. Music was important to folks back then. Still is, apparently. Samuel, where exactly are the pianos? I've been through this whole building except the third floor. His expression grew guarded. Third floor storage, son. Old equipment, records, and things we don't use anymore, and it stays locked for good reasons. What kind of reasons? He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. How long you been working here now? 6 weeks? 7? And you're still following the rules? All of them? Yes, sir. He nodded slowly. The 3rd floor used to be living quarters. Back when funeral homes were family businesses and the family lived on site. Samuel Whitmore Sr., my grandfather, lived up there with his wife, Catherine. She was a beautiful woman, played piano like an angel, gave concerts in the parlor on Sunday afternoons. He paused, looking out the window toward the cemetery. Catherine died in 1953. Sudden illness. Took her in 3 days. Grandfather was devastated. Had her embalmed and laid out in Parlor A for 2 weeks before the family finally insisted on burial. But he never got over losing her. Started claiming he could hear her playing piano at night. Started spending all his time up there in their old room. What happened to him? Found him one morning in 1954, sitting at Catherine's piano bench. Been dead for hours, but he was smiling, peaceful-like. We buried them together, but he shrugged. Some folks don't stay buried, especially when they got unfinished business. That night, the piano music started earlier than usual, 11:30 p.m., just as I finished my first round of door checks. But this time, it was different. Instead of the classical pieces I'd grown accustomed to, someone was playing For Elise, the same simple melody over and over, as if they were learning it or teaching it. At 1 a.m., I heard a second piano join in, playing a harmony line to the main melody. The 2 instruments created a hauntingly beautiful duet that seemed to fill the entire building. I tried to focus on my book, but the music was too beautiful to ignore completely. Despite Rule 3, I found myself listening, trying to identify the exact pieces being played. That's when I heard the 3rd piano. This one was different, older sounding, with keys that didn't quite hold their tune. It played a simple melody underneath the other 2, like a child trying to keep up with accomplished musicians. 3 pianos, in a building that supposedly had no pianos at all. I was still pondering this when, at 2:47 a.m., all the music stopped at once. The silence was deafening after nearly 3 hours of continuous playing. I sat in the office, straining to hear something, anything that would explain the sudden quiet. That's when I heard the footsteps on the stairs, not the measured pacing I'd grown used to on the 2nd floor. These were coming down from the 3rd floor, slow, deliberate steps on the wooden staircase that led to the locked door. Step, pause, step, pause, as if someone was being very careful not to make too much noise. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the base of the stairs. In the faint light filtering through the front windows, I could see the staircase leading up to the 2nd floor, then disappearing around a corner toward the 3rd. The footsteps had reached the 2nd floor landing. Rule 8 came to mind, but this felt different. The woman in white had never made noise before, never announced her presence with footsteps. She simply appeared and disappeared, like a photograph fading in and out of focus. These footsteps belonged to someone, or something, with substance and weight. They paused at the 2nd floor landing, and I held my breath. Then they continued down toward the 1st floor, toward me. I backed into the office and partially closed the door, leaving just enough gap to see the staircase. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct. I could hear the old wooden steps creaking under the weight of whoever was descending. A figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs. It was a man in a dark suit, tall and thin, with silver hair combed back in an old-fashioned style. He looked solid, real, completely normal except for one detail. His feet didn't quite touch the ground. He hovered an inch or 2 above the floor, moving with a gliding motion that made no sound despite the footsteps I'd been hearing. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, turning his head as if listening for something. In profile, he looked exactly like the photograph of Samuel Whitmore Sr. that hung in the main parlor. Grandfather Samuel. He turned toward the office and I got a full view of his face. Kind eyes, gentle expression, nothing threatening or frightening. He looked like someone's beloved grandfather, which, I suppose, He was. He nodded politely, the same acknowledgement I'd grown used to from the woman in white, and glided toward Parlor A. I watched through the crack in the door as he paused outside the parlor, reaching for the handle with hands that passed through it like mist. He tried several times, growing more agitated with each failure. Finally, he turned back toward me, and I saw desperation in his eyes. He raised one translucent hand and pointed toward the third floor, then toward the parlor, then back to the third floor. The message was clear. He wanted something from upstairs brought down to the parlor. But Rule 9 was absolute. The third floor door must remain locked at all times. I shook my head slightly, trying to convey that I couldn't help him. His expression grew sad, resigned. He nodded once more and glided back toward the stairs. I watched him ascend, his form growing fainter with each step until he disappeared entirely at the second floor landing. The building fell silent again, but the silence felt different now. Heavier, charged with disappointment and longing. When Samuel arrived the next morning, I told him everything. "Grandfather's been restless lately," he said, not seeming particularly surprised. "Usually happens this time of year. October was when Catherine got sick." "What did he want me to bring downstairs?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the cemetery. "There's a music box up there." Catherine's favorite piece was Für Elise. Simple little melody, but it meant the world to her. The music box is sitting on the piano bench in their old room. He wants to bring it to the parlor, wants to play it for the folks we're laying out. Catherine always said music helped people find peace. Grandfather thinks if he could just share her music with the deceased, help them transition. Samuel shrugged. "But we can't let him up there, and we can't bring anything down. Too dangerous." "Why is the third floor dangerous?" "Because grandfather never accepted Catherine's death. That room is frozen in time, Marcus. 1953, the day she died. Anyone who goes up there gets caught in that moment, trapped in his grief. We've lost 2 morticians that way over the years. They went up to investigate the piano music and never came back down. Not really." "They died?" "No, son. Death would be a mercy. They're still up there, still playing piano with Catherine and grandfather, still living in 1953. We bring them food, but they don't remember why they need it. They don't remember anything past the day they climbed those stairs." The weight of this revelation settled over me like a shroud. The building wasn't just haunted, it was a trap, a pocket of frozen time that caught anyone who ventured too close to its center. "That's why Rule 9 exists," Samuel continued. "That door stays locked not to keep grandfather and Catherine in, but to keep the living out. The temptation to help them, to fix things, is strong. But you can't fix death, Marcus. You can only learn to coexist with it." That night, I approached my shift with a new understanding of the stakes. Every rule existed because someone had learned, through tragedy and loss, what happened when the boundaries between life and death grew thin. The piano music started again at 11:45 p.m., but now I recognized the melody being repeated over and over. Für Elise, played with the patient persistence of someone teaching a beloved student. At 2:30 a.m., the phone rang. I let the machine pick up, but instead of breathing, I heard a woman's voice, clear and beautiful despite the crackling of the old recording equipment. "Samuel? Samuel, is that you? I can't find my music box. Have you seen my little music box?" The voice of Catherine Whitmore, still looking for her treasured possession 70 years after her death. At 3 a.m., during my rounds, I found Parlor A's door standing open. Inside, Grandfather Samuel stood beside an empty casket, his translucent hands moving as if conducting an invisible orchestra. He was humming Für Elise, the same simple melody that had been playing upstairs. I closed the door gently, following Rule 2, but I could still hear the humming through the wood. Soft, sad, infinitely patient. The rest of the night passed without incident. but I couldn't shake the image of Grandfather Samuel conducting his invisible orchestra, trying to share Catherine's music with the deceased in the only way he could. When my 3-month probation ended, Samuel called me into his office for a formal evaluation. "You've done good work, Marcus, real good. Most folks don't last past the first week, but you've been following the rules, keeping your head down, showing proper respect for the residents." "The residents?" He smiled slightly. "Living and otherwise. This place is home to a lot of folks, son. Some of them just happen to be dead." He pulled out a new contract, this one for permanent employment at $22 an hour. "I'm promoting you to senior night watchman. Comes with a raise and some additional responsibilities." I scanned the contract, noting the higher pay and the phrase advanced protocol training. "What kind of additional responsibilities?" Samuel opened a different filing cabinet and withdrew a thicker folder marked Level 2 Protocols. "Now that you've proven you can handle the basics, it's time you learned about the deeper rules, the ones that keep this whole arrangement stable." He opened the folder, revealing pages of handwritten instructions, maps of the building and grounds, and what looked like historical documents. "Every few months, certain situations arise that require direct intervention. Nothing dangerous if you follow procedures, but critical for maintaining the balance." The first page was a map of the building with areas marked in different colors. The 3rd floor was marked in red with the notation, "Temporal Anomaly, Do Not Enter." The basement was marked in yellow, "Active Zone, Monitoring Required." The cemetery behind the building was marked in blue with dozens of small symbols I didn't recognize. "What are these symbols?" "Graves that need regular attention. Some of our residents are more restless than others. Once a month, you'll need to make rounds through the cemetery, leave small offerings at marked graves, maintain certain boundaries." He flipped to the next page, which contained a schedule. "Full moon nights require extra vigilance. New moon nights are usually quiet, but the real challenge comes during what we call convergence events, times when the boundary between life and death gets particularly thin." "How often do these happen?" 3, maybe 4 times a year. Halloween's always one, of course, but there are others. Dates that correspond to particularly tragic events in the building's history. We'll give you plenty of warning and support when those come up." I stared at the folder, realizing that what I'd experienced so far was just the surface level of whatever was happening at Whitmore and Sons. "Samuel, what exactly is this place?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those cloudy blue eyes. "You ever hear the term place, Marcus? Spots where the natural world and the spirit world come close together? This ground's been a thin place for centuries. Native tribes knew it, early settlers learned it the hard way, and we've been managing it for 4 generations. Managing it how? By maintaining proper relationships with the residents, living and dead, temporary and permanent. The rules exist because my grandfather, my father, and I learned, through trial and error, how to keep everyone safe and reasonably content." He gestured toward the window that looked out over the cemetery. "There are 847 people buried on this property, Marcus. Most of them are resting peacefully, but about 50 of them never quite moved on, and another dozen or so are what you might call actively involved in day-to-day operations. Like Grandfather Samuel and Catherine. Like Grandfather and Catherine, they're not malicious, just stuck. My job is to make sure they stay stuck here, where they can be monitored and contained instead of wandering off to bother the living." The scope of it was staggering. I wasn't just a night watchman. I was a caretaker for a community that existed partially outside normal reality. "What happens if I quit?" Samuel's expression grew serious. "Honestly, we'd have to shut down operations and call in the state authorities to handle containment. 50 displaced spirits suddenly turned loose on Bledsoe County wouldn't end well for anybody." The weight of responsibility settled over me like a lead blanket. 50 souls depended on me to maintain the careful balance that kept them contained and peaceful. "I need some time to think about this. Of course, Take the weekend. But Marcus, he stood up and walked to the window. This isn't just a job anymore. It's a calling. Some people are meant for this kind of work, and you've demonstrated that you've the right temperament. The residents trust you already. That's not something that happens often. That weekend, I drove into the mountains to think, away from the funeral home's influence, surrounded by normal October scenery, changing leaves, clear streams, living trees reaching toward a living sky. But even there, I couldn't shake the image of Grandfather Samuel conducting his invisible orchestra, or Catherine's voice asking about her music box, or the woman in white eternally searching for something at the upstairs windows. They weren't evil. They weren't even really frightening once you understood their nature. They were just lost, stuck between one world and the next, dependent on the living to maintain the delicate balance that kept them from dissolution or worse. By Sunday evening, I knew I couldn't abandon them. I returned to work Monday night with my signed contract and a new understanding of my role. Samuel met me at the door with a satisfied nod. Welcome to level 2, son. Iris will train you on the monthly cemetery rounds, and I'll walk you through the convergence event protocols. First one's Halloween, 3 weeks away. What happens during a convergence event? The boundaries get thin enough that living and dead can interact more directly. Usually it's peaceful, old conversations finishing up, final messages passed along, that sort of thing. But sometimes, he paused, sometimes someone tries to cross over permanently, in either direction. The implications of that hit me like a cold wind. You mean living people try to join the dead? And dead people try to rejoin the living. Both are equally dangerous for everyone involved. Your job is to maintain the boundaries, keep everyone on their proper side of the line. That night, armed with my new knowledge and responsibilities, I approached my shift differently. Instead of simply enduring the supernatural activity, I began to see it as part of a larger community that I was now responsible for protecting. When the piano music started at midnight, I listened with new appreciation for the skill and dedication of the musicians. 3 people, separated by decades and death itself, still making music together because that's what brought them joy. When the phone rang at 2:15 a.m., I felt sympathy for Catherine's confused calls, still searching for the music box that represented her connection to the world of the living. At 3 a.m., when I found Parlor's door standing open, I peered inside and saw not a threat, but a small act of service. One of the residents paying respects to the newly deceased, welcoming them to their temporary stay before final rest. I was no longer just following rules to survive. I was participating in a complex, centuries-old system of mutual care and respect between the living and the dead. The work was still eerie, still challenging, still unlike anything I'd ever imagined when I answered Samuel's job posting, but it was also meaningful in a way that transcended normal employment. 3 weeks later, Halloween arrived, with unseasonable warmth and an electric tension that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. Samuel and Iris arrived at sunset with additional equipment: salt, candles, some kind of electronic monitoring devices, and a thick binder labeled emergency protocols. Tonight's going to be different, Samuel explained as we set up monitoring equipment in each parlor. Halloween isn't just about trick-or-treaters and candy. It's the one night when the boundary between worlds gets thin enough for real communication. Iris was arranging salt lines at every threshold, her movements precise and practiced. The residents will be more active tonight, she said without looking up. More visible, more audible, more present. Your job is to facilitate peaceful interactions while preventing anyone from crossing over permanently. How do I know if someone's trying to cross over? Samuel handed me a small device that looked like a modified radio. This will pick up temperature fluctuations and electromagnetic disturbances. If the readings spike into the red zone, someone's attempting a permanent transition. Use this. He showed me a silver whistle on a chain. 3 sharp blasts will reinforce the boundaries and push everyone back to their proper side. As darkness fell, the building began to change. The usual subtle manifestations grew stronger, more defined. The piano music started earlier and louder, with all three instruments playing in perfect harmony. The basement voices became clear enough to make out individual words, though they spoke in languages I didn't recognize. At 10:30 p.m., 15 minutes before my official shift started, Grandfather Samuel appeared in the main hallway, but tonight he looked solid, real, as if he were still alive. He smiled and tipped his hat to me, the first time any of the residents had acknowledged my presence so directly. "Good evening, young man," he said, his voice carrying the faint accent of someone born in the 1800s. "Lovely night for visiting, don't you think?" The monitoring device in my pocket was beeping softly, elevated readings but still in the yellow zone. "Yes, sir," I replied, remembering Samuel's instructions about being polite but not engaging in lengthy conversations. Catherine's so excited about tonight. She's been practicing her pieces for weeks, wanting everything to be perfect for the gathering. The gathering? Oh yes, Halloween's when all the residents come together, living and dead, old and new. It's quite the social event. He paused, looking wistful. "She's hoping you might bring down her music box. Just for tonight. It would mean the world to her." The temptation was enormous. He seemed so normal, so reasonable. What harm could there be in granting a simple request from a lonely old man who just wanted to make his wife happy? But I remembered the warnings about the trapped morticians still playing piano in 1953. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't access the third floor. Rules, you understand." His expression grew sad but accepting. "Of course. Rules exist for good reasons. Well, perhaps she'll understand. Enjoy the gathering, young man. You're in for quite a show." He faded gradually, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. By 11 p.m., the building was more alive than I'd ever experienced. The monitoring device was beeping constantly as residents materialized throughout the funeral home. I could see figures in period clothing moving through the parlors, hear conversations in multiple languages and time periods overlapping like radio stations bleeding into each other. In Parlor A, a woman in a 1920s flapper dress was deep in conversation with a man in Civil War uniform. Parlor B hosted what appeared to be a family reunion spanning several generations, with people in clothing from different decades all talking animatedly. Parlor C had become an impromptu concert hall, with residents gathered around the piano music that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The phone rang at midnight exactly. This time, instead of letting the machine pick up, I followed my new instructions and answered. "Whitmore & Sons Funeral Home, Marcus speaking." "Marcus?" Catherine's voice was clear and warm, no longer distorted by the old recording equipment. "How wonderful to finally speak with you properly. Samuel's told me so much about your kindness." "It's nice to meet you too, Mrs. Whitmore. Please, call me Catherine. Now, I hate to bother you, but I'm organizing tonight's musical program and I was hoping, well, my music box has the most beautiful arrangement of Fur Elise. It would be perfect for the evening's finale." The monitoring device was beeping more insistently now, readings climbing toward the red zone. "I'm sorry, Catherine, but I can't access the third floor. It's locked for safety reasons." There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of desperation that made my heart ache. "Marcus, I've been trying to perfect this piece for 70 years. Tonight might be my only chance to share it with everyone, to finally complete what I started before I got so sick." The reading spiked into red territory. Catherine wasn't just requesting the music box. She was trying to pull me into her frozen moment of 1953, where she could have her perfect musical evening and I could be trapped forever helping her achieve it. I lifted the silver whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts. The effect was immediate. The phone went dead, the beeping device returned to yellow readings, and I heard a collective sigh from all the residents throughout the building. Disappointment, but also understanding. Samuel Jr. had warned me this might happen. The residents weren't malicious, but their needs and desires could become so strong on Halloween night that they unconsciously tried to pull the living into their world permanently. The evening continued with a parade of interactions. A little girl in a Victorian dress asked if I'd seen her doll. A soldier from World War I wanted to know if the war was over yet. An elderly woman in 1960s clothing kept insisting I call her daughter to let her know she was all right. Each interaction required careful navigation, enough politeness to avoid offending them, but not enough engagement to get drawn into their particular frozen moments or unfulfilled needs. The most challenging came at 2:30 a.m. I was making my rounds when I found all 3 parlor doors standing wide open. Inside each room, the residents had arranged themselves as if posing for a photograph. Parlor A held the older residents, people from the 1800s and early 1900s, dressed in their finest funeral attire. Parlor B contained the mid-century crowd, 1940s through 1970s, a mix of formal wear and more casual clothing. Parlor C was filled with the more recent arrivals, people who died in the last 20 years. They all turned to look at me as I appeared in the hallway, and I realized they'd been waiting. "Marcus," called out a woman from Parlor B whom I'd never seen before. "We've been discussing the situation, and we'd like to make a formal request." The monitoring device was vibrating in my pocket, readings spiking dangerously high. "We understand the rules," continued a man from Parlor A in a thick Scottish accent. "We respect the boundaries, but tonight, just for a few hours, we'd like you to join us properly. Not as a watchman or caretaker, but as a guest." "We miss having living people at our gatherings," added someone from Parlor C. "It's been so long since we could have a proper conversation with someone who remembers what sunshine feels like." The temptation was overwhelming. They looked so normal, so friendly, just lonely people wanting companionship. What harm could there be in chatting for a few minutes? But the monitoring device was screaming now, readings completely in the red. This wasn't just a social invitation. It was a coordinated attempt to pull me permanently into their world. I raised the silver whistle, but before I could blow it, Grandfather Samuel appeared beside me. Now, he said gently to the assembled residents. "You all know better than that. The young man has responsibilities to the living world. We can't keep him here, no matter how much we'd enjoy his company." The readings on the device began to drop as the residents reluctantly stepped back from their coordinated pull. "We understand," said the woman from Parlor B. "But Samuel, it gets so lonely sometimes. Decades of talking only to each other, never learning anything new about the world we left behind." "I know, dear, I know." Grandfather Samuel's voice was infinitely compassionate. "But Marcus visits us every night. He listens to our music, acknowledges our presence, treats us with dignity and respect. That's more than most of the living offered to the dead." He turned to me, his expression grateful. "You've done well tonight, son, maintaining boundaries while showing proper courtesy. That's the balance this job requires." The residents began to disperse, fading back into their normal, subtle presence. The parlor doors swung shut one by one. The monitoring device's readings returned to normal yellow levels. But the night wasn't over. At 4 a.m., just as I thought the danger zone was ending, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps on the third-floor stairs. Not the careful, measured steps of Grandfather Samuel. These were quick, urgent, like someone running. The footsteps reached the second floor, then continued down to the first. A moment later, a figure burst into the main hallway. A young woman in a hospital gown, her hair wild, eyes wide with panic. She was solid, real, clearly alive. But she shouldn't have been able to get into the building, and she definitely shouldn't have come from the third floor. "Help me," she gasped, grabbing my arm with hands that were ice cold. "They won't let me leave. I've been trying to get out for... how long have I been here?" The monitoring device was shrieking, readings off the charts. This wasn't a resident trying to cross over. This was a living person who'd somehow gotten trapped in the building's temporal anomalies. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to stay calm. Jennifer Jennifer Walsh. I'm a nursing student. I was doing research on historical medical practices. Someone told me about the old embalming equipment in the basement, so I broke in to take photos for my thesis. My heart sank. She'd triggered one of the building's defenses, gotten caught in the same kind of temporal loop that trapped the morticians on the 3rd floor. Jennifer, what year do you think it is? 2023. October 30th, 2023. I arrived here last night, but I'm having trouble finding the exit. Every door I try just leads to more rooms, more hallways, and there are people everywhere, but when I try to talk to them, they act like I'm not there. She'd been trapped for almost a year, caught in her personal time loop while the building tried to process her presence. I grabbed my radio and called Samuel's emergency number. "We've got a code yellow," I said when he answered. "Living person trapped in temporal anomaly. Name's Jennifer Walsh, nursing student, been missing since October 2023. Jesus, Samuel's voice crackled through the radio. How'd she get to the 1st floor? Came down from the 3rd floor. Long pause. That's impossible. 3rd floor's been locked for... Another pause. Unless... Holloway night. The boundaries are so thin that someone trapped up there might be able to move around the building freely. What do I do? Keep her calm. Don't let her go back upstairs. I'm calling Iris and the emergency team. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Jennifer was growing more agitated, pacing the hallway like a caged animal. I need to get out, she kept repeating. I have classes tomorrow. My roommate will be worried. I need to get out. Jennifer, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You've been missing for almost a year. It's now October 2024. You've been trapped in this building's temporal field. She stared at me, uncomprehending. That's impossible. It's been one night. One long, weird night, but just one night. That's when I understood the true horror of what had happened to her. She'd been reliving this same night over and over, trapped in October 30th, 2023, while the real world moved on without her. Samuel, Iris, and 2 people I'd never seen before arrived within 15 minutes, carrying equipment that looked like a cross between medical devices and something from a science fiction movie. Jennifer Walsh, one of the newcomers asked gently. I'm Dr. Chen, a specialist in temporal displacement cases. We're here to help you get back to your proper timeline. My proper what? Dr. Chen began setting up devices around Jennifer, creating a circle of softly humming machines. You've been caught in what we call a temporal eddy, she explained, a pocket of time that's been repeating the same 24-hour period. We're going to synchronize you with the current timeline and get you back to the real world. The process took 2 hours. Jennifer sat in the center of the machine circle while readouts fluctuated and the devices hummed at different frequencies. Gradually, her appearance began to change. Her hospital gown aged and faded, her hair grew slightly, and a year's worth of subtle physical changes compressed into minutes as she caught up with real time. When it was over, she collapsed, sobbing with relief and confusion. I remember now, she whispered, all those repeated nights, trying to get out, talking to people who couldn't hear me. It felt like forever, but it also felt like no time at all. That's normal, Dr. Chen assured her. Temporal displacement often causes that kind of dissociation. You'll need counseling and medical monitoring, but you should recover fully. As dawn broke, they loaded Jennifer into an ambulance for transport to a specialized facility that dealt with supernatural trauma cases. She'd lost a year of her life, but she was alive and would eventually be able to return to the normal world. Samuel waited until the ambulance disappeared before turning to me. That, he said, is why we have the rules, son. That's why the 3rd floor stays locked. Jennifer's lucky. She only lost a year. The morticians up there have been trapped since 1985 and 1992. They're still living the day they decided to investigate the piano music. Will they ever get out? Maybe. Every Halloween, the boundary's thin enough that escape becomes possible, but they'd have to want to escape more than they want to keep playing music with Catherine. And after 30-some years, he shrugged sadly. That music's become their whole world. The rest of my shift passed quietly. The residents had retreated to their normal, subtle presence, exhausted by the night's activities. The monitoring device remained silent. The building felt almost normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about Jennifer Walsh, trapped in her single night for a full year, or about the morticians still playing piano in 1953, or about Catherine endlessly searching for her music box. Monsters, demons, or evil spirits didn't cause the horror of Whitmore and Sons. It was the simple, devastating tragedy of people unable to let go, of life, of love, of the moment before everything went wrong. And it was the equal tragedy of the living who got too close to that inability, who became trapped in someone else's frozen moment. When Samuel arrived at 8 a.m., I was sitting in the office, staring out at the cemetery where 847 people lay buried, and roughly 50 of them refused to stay that way. "Rough night," he observed. "Yeah. You did well, son. Real good. Jennifer's alive because you followed protocols and called for help instead of trying to handle it yourself. Samuel, how many people have been lost to this place over the years?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking older than his 70-some years. "Too many. However, not as many as there would have been if we had just abandoned it. This place needs tending, Marcus. The residents need someone who understands their nature, who can maintain the boundaries while treating them with dignity. And if I quit, if I can't handle this anymore, then we find someone else, someone who can do the job with the same care and respect you've shown. But Marcus," he fixed me with those cloudy blue eyes, "this work gets into your blood, changes you. Most folks who are suited for it don't want to leave." He was right. Despite the fear, despite the supernatural dangers, despite nights like Halloween that tested every limit of human endurance, I couldn't imagine walking away from the residents who depended on me. Over the following months, I settled into my new role as senior night watchman. I learned about the monthly cemetery rounds, where I would visit graves marked with symbols and leave small offerings, flowers, music boxes, photographs. Things that helped anchor the restless dead to peaceful memories rather than desperate yearning. I learned to recognize the signs of convergence events before they reached crisis levels, and how to gently redirect residents who were becoming too focused on crossing over permanently. I learned that Iris had been working at the funeral home for 37 years and that she could communicate with the basement residents in languages that the living hadn't spoken for over a century. I learned that Samuel's father had died in the building in 1978, and that he sometimes appeared in the office late at night to discuss business matters with his son, offering advice from beyond the grave. Most importantly, I learned that the horror of Whitmore and Sons wasn't something to be endured or survived. It was something to be understood, respected, and carefully managed. The residents weren't monsters. They were people caught between worlds, dependent on the living to maintain the delicate balance that kept them stable and contained. It's been 8 months now since that first night when I ignored the piano music and followed the rules through sheer terror. The work still challenges me, still requires constant vigilance and emotional strength I didn't know I possessed, but it's also become something more than a job. It's a calling, a purpose, a way of serving both the living and the dead with equal compassion. Tonight is another Halloween, and I'm preparing for my second convergence event as senior night watchman. The monitoring equipment is calibrated, the salt lines are fresh, and the emergency protocols are updated with lessons learned from Jennifer Walsh's rescue. The residents are already stirring, excited by the thin boundaries between worlds that are approaching. I can hear Catherine practicing scales upstairs, Grandfather Samuel humming as he prepares for another evening of conducting his invisible orchestra. In a few hours, I'll witness another gathering of souls spanning centuries, all seeking peace in a world that exists somewhere between memory and eternity. And I'll be there to watch over them, to maintain the boundaries that keep everyone safe, and to offer the simple dignity of acknowledgement to people who died long before I was born, but who still, in their way, live on. The dead, I've learned, don't want much from the living. Just respect, just a remembrance, just someone willing to follow the rules that keep the delicate balance between worlds intact. It's not the job I thought I was applying for when I walked into Samuel Whitmore's office 8 months ago. It's so much more important than that.